Hi there MXNetters. In today's video we're going to be looking at MXBoard. And MXBoard is a fantastic tool for visualizing MXNet and the different components of MXNet. So we could use it, for example, to look at the graphical structure of your neural network that you created to understand the data flow through the model. We could use it to understand and interpret the model. So we could look at activations in certain layers and visualize those so you get an understanding of what features the model is extracting. And you can also use it to monitor training. If you look at the training metrics over time, we can get an idea whether the model is converging or diverging, for example. So a whole host of different uses for MXBoard visualizations. And it's a tool that's used in conjunction with TensorBoard. So TensorBoard originally was intended for use with TensorFlow, and that was the visualization tool for TensorFlow. But MXBoard helps you use all those great tools from TensorBoard with MXNet. So what exactly is MXBoard? Well, MXBoard is a Python package, so it's something we're going to import into our training scripts and use there. And we use it to log MXNet data to disk. And specifically, it's in a format that's required by TensorBoard. So the core class that we're going to be using with MXBoard is something called a summary writer. And when we've created the summary writer, we can log MXNet data to disk in the correct format. So we'd specify what type of data we're saving, and then MXBoard will save it in the correct format, which is protocol buffers format, with the correct schema that's expected by TensorBoard. So all the rendering and visualization is done correctly. The different data types that we could use with MXBoard and TensorBoard, we've got a great variety of them. And looking at the graphs, we can understand the structure of networks. With scalars, we can record single values over time. We've got histograms, which is going to look at more of the distributions of values over time. Embeddings are a great way to look at the structure of your data, so it's much more unsupervised methods, such as PCA and t-SNE. We've got image visualization. This could be visualizing the input images to your model, or it could be looking at activations partway through your model. Text is another thing that can be rendered. So this could be an output of your model, or it could be recording hyperparameters, for example. Precision and recall curve, this gets calculated automatically given predictions and the labels. We'll look at different thresholds and plot the precision recall curves for you. And lastly, we've got audio. So if your model is creating an audio signal, we can play it through TensorBoard and you can hear it through speakers, which is really great. So how do we install MXBoard? Well, it's super simple. We can just use pip for this. We want MXNet installed already. Check out the website for proper installation steps, especially if you're looking to use MXNet with GPUs, because we want the CUDA compiled versions for that. But just to get the base version running, you can just do pip install MXNet. And then for MXBoard, all we need to do is pip install MXBoard. To then do the visualization components, we're going to need TensorBoard, and TensorBoard needs TensorFlow installed. And we want the versions to be the same for both of these two, otherwise we could get some incompatibility issues. So if we install TensorFlow 1.7, for example, we want TensorBoard 1.7. Now we've got everything set up, how do we use MXBoard? So it's a two-part process. The first part is where we save the data to the disk, and then in the second part, we want to read that data from disk and visualize it. So the first part is managed by MXBoard. So we're going to import MXBoard here because we're wanting to record MXNet data. We also import MXNet. And then you'll notice for our import of MXBoard, we're just importing the summary writer. And that's typically what you do when you're using MXBoard because it's the core object that we want to be working with. Then, once we want to get started recording data, we typically open a context for the summary writer. This is similar to a file in Python. You can manually open the file and then do your writing and close the file. But managing through a context makes it much easier because when you're finished writing to the file, and you're outside the context, Python automatically closes it for you, which is really useful. So here we're just going to create a context by using with. As we go with summary writer, this we specify where we want the summaries to be written. This is where the MXNet data is going to be going. And we want to be using a subfolder. This is good practice to label exactly where we want the data to be written. Because when you use TensorBoard, this is the label that we're going to see in the visualizations. So here we'll just call it intro example, and we'll see that later on. Then we've just given it an alias, so we can reference the summary writer down later on in the code. And now we're inside the context. Here we're just looping through 10 values from 0 to 9, and we're calculating the square of that value. So x is then squared to give us y. Now, using the summary writer that we've opened, we can call the add scalar method. Scalar is just a single value that we want to be recording, and so we'll see this as a chart in TensorBoard. We give the scalar a tag, just so we can give it a name. Although we've given the run a name, we can also break that down further because we might have lots of different metrics for a particular run. So here we're calling it quadratic. Next we specify the value that we want to record. So we're calculating quadratic, the squared, so we've just put the y as our value. And then our step, this is typically what we see on the horizontal x-axis, and we're going to put x as our global step. Often when you're monitoring training runs, your global step will either be the iteration that you're on, like the batch, or the epoch. So if we run that, we'll be writing to disk. So now we can check out what files have been saved. Here we're just using bash to show what's in the logs directory, and we've got one folder. And the folder is intro example, and that's what we called our run in the code before. Now if we drill down and look in the logs intro example folder, we see we've got an events file. So this is the file that's saved in the format expected by TensorBoard. It's in the protocol buffers format in the correct schema for scalars. Now that we've got the file, we need to move on to the visualization part. This is managed by TensorBoard. So to start the TensorBoard server, this is going to be a web server. This is something you can access through your browser once you've started it. We need to open in a separate shell, and we want to be calling TensorBoard directly. Once we've done a pip install, we should be able to just access TensorBoard. So we can call TensorBoard. Then we specify the logs directory. So this is where we have saved the data in MXBoard. Note here, I'm actually directing it to the logs directory. And so TensorBoard will look in this directory and look for subfolders so it can find the different runs. So we're just pointing it to the logs directory here. And lastly, we specify the port that we want this web server to run on, so we know where to access it. An alternative to creating it in a separate shell is just within Python. We can create sub-processes, so that's what I'm just doing here. So we can create our TensorBoard server and start that through the notebook. Now that we've got this server running, we can move on over to localhost and then the port that we've specified. So let's take a look now. And there we go. This is our first look at TensorBoard. So TensorBoard will scan through the contents of the logs directory, work out what data it's got available and what runs have been saved. So here we've got the intro example run, and for the intro example run, it detected that there was some scalar data. So we see the scalars tab has been enabled, and we see the plot of our data with the label quadratic. So by default, there's some smoothing applied to scalars, so we can turn that off to see our plot. And these plots are interactive. So if you hover over the points, you'll be able to see what values it corresponds to. So take an example, let's say we've got an x of 4, which was our global step. 4 squared should be 16, and we can see that the value is 16. It's also quite useful because it records the time at which the scalar value was recorded. This is really useful for measuring the speeds of training runs. And we'll look at this in more detail in future videos. When we're finished with TensorBoard, we can stop the process, and that will kill the web server, so we'll no longer be able to access it on that port. And you could even go ahead and remove the logs if you don't need them any longer. Great, so that was a quick overview of MXBoard, where it fits in and how to use it in simple cases. In the next video, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into specific data types that can be recorded with MXBoard. We'll look at how to do it with MXBoard and then what the visualization will look like with TensorBoard. So I'll see you in the next video.